Time today. My name is Matt Golden, and as I was introduced, I'm CEO of Open Energy Efficiency. I'm looking forward to talking about some of our experiences here in the U.S. markets. Primarily, I'm going to focus on California, and which is where our company was born from, but is also one of the more extreme cases in the U.S., but by no means unique in terms of the impacts that we're seeing from moving more aggressively towards renewable energy portfolio targets, as well as in California, New York, and actually a growing number of states and utilities across the country, setting really aggressive zero carbon targets, and really focusing on how we enable these clean energy resources to be utilized properly as we decarbonize the grid, and how we can combine traditional DERs in the form of storage and grid and infrastructure investments with a more comprehensive and product agnostic approach to valuing the impact of behind the meter efficiency, as well as demand response, electrification, and frankly, in many cases, storage and other interventions that are occurring behind the meters affecting demand that can be used as a load balancing resource for renewables, T&D resource to replace grid infrastructure and fossil fuel infrastructure, as well as a direct carbon reduction and bill savings for customers. Let's see. So I'm going to start out with some of the more basic information just to kind of frame this conversation. I'll talk a little bit initially about open energy efficiency and what it is that we're providing to the market and to whom, really just to frame the conversation so that we all are on kind of the same page. So one of the big challenges when we measure the impact of demand-side interventions, such as energy efficiency and electrification, is simply that we are not measuring it. We're calculating a counterfactual. And so when we talk about opening up markets, one of the first issues involved is agreeing on a weights and measures. If you're going to have a market where you're transacting in a product, that product might be load shift, T&D value, capacity, energy. There has to be an agreement on what that product, what actually our yield is across all parties to enable grid procurement folks to take these resources seriously, but also to enable financial transactions. And one of the big challenges in M&V measurement of energy efficiency interventions and electrification is the diversity of methods and resulting in many different correct answers. And that's kind of the joke. You can give 100 buildings to 5 different energy efficiency engineers, have them conduct M&V, and you can very easily end up with a 20% different answer, and all of them being equally correct, because historically we've lacked definition on how we actually do these calculations in a consistent and transparent way. So I'm going to go through, like I said, some of the underpinnings, and then we'll kind of get into the meat of the conversation. So open energy efficiency, we've actually been working initially here in California, but now with about 80 stakeholders across many different states in the U.S. and starting to be working with folks in Europe as well as Australia to standardize these methods. And so the fundamentals is agreeing to how we actually calculate the impact. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it, you can't deploy it. So we were involved in the stakeholder process that we actually ran, again, initially on behalf of the investor-owned utilities here in California, developing what we call the CalTrack methods. They're available on caltrack.org. And what they are fundamentally is a very detailed set of methodological approaches that take you from meter data. We can function with monthly data. However, when we start talking about load shifting, it requires interval data. But everything in that process, the hundreds of little engineering choices in terms of how you clean the data, assign weather stations, and ultimately do the normalizations for weather and occupancy patterns and aggregate results. So the big difference with CalTrack is the level of specificity to the degree that can actually be replicated across parties, and the fact that the methods choices were actually tested against large bodies of empirical data, and all of that data science is available. So CalTrack methods represents a standard approach. Interesting. So is my screen, I'm getting to define a standard transparent approach. All parties can replicate it. There's no black box. And we also developed a tool which is completely open source. It was originally funded by the California Energy Commission. We're actually in the process now of moving this engine into the Linux Foundation, which runs the CalTrack methods in a consistent way and available to all parties without restrictions. And the way to think about this body of work, CalTrack and the OpenE meter, is a standardized weights and measures and agreement on how we track results that can be replicated across all parties transparently and can be tested on empirical data to understand how the level of uncertainty involved with these calculations. What we do as a business, and this is pretty much the only thing I'm going to touch on in terms of OpenEE as an actual product, we provide these CalTrack methods to utilities and also to market actors, companies that are deploying products and technologies in the marketplace to enable the tracking of energy efficiency, again, on a monthly, daily, and hourly basis in real time, both to send a price signal and forecast and quantify the impact that's occurring, and also as a tool for companies who are deploying technologies to target the right customers, optimize their business models, and ultimately get paid for the impact that they're having, like they're building a power plant. So those first slides just kind of framing what it is we're actually doing, and just to be clear on what is actually open source and then what our company provides. So the reason that we open source both those methods and the open source OpenEE meter is that you can't build a market where measurement is a black box. No party can own the ability to measure. And so it's critical that whether you're an IoT company or an installation company or a utility or a regulator, that we have agreement on how these results are measured that can be quantified and confidence across the board. And that's really the fundamental enabler for energy efficiency and electrification measures as a grid resource. Now I'm going to dive in at kind of a higher level and talk a little bit about the problems that are occurring here. Initially in the California market, we see similar issues emerging throughout the U.S. markets. Load shapes look different in different locations depending on the resource mix. But the fundamental issue is that as we decarbonize and move to these clean energy resources, they're intermittent and create new load shapes that need to be dealt with if we want to fully decarbonize the grid. This is the California duck curve. This is the actual duck curve, and you might be familiar with a more traditional graphic from the CAISO, which is actually a projection. And the most important thing is that in California, when we look at our projection from about 6 years ago, we're 4 years ahead in terms of how fast the duck is developing. It's getting deeper, lasting longer, peaking higher and earlier. As we accelerate the adoption of clean energy, it's actually having a larger impact than expected on the grid and creating much more demand. So this is resulting in some significant problems. So this graphic that shows on the left the CAISO load shape and on the right the cost of wholesale energy. This is 2017, but on this day we set a record. We've since beat that record in California but we set the record on this day for the most renewables on the California grid. Everybody was writing articles and blogs and it was celebrating. We're generating lots of renewables, which is great and essential. But what this is actually resulting in is we're not saving carbon because we're at base load capacity, because that afternoon ramp requires us to keep our natural gas resources and peak plants running to meet the demand in the late afternoon when we have a coincidental peak of residential and commercial loads. And so we're actually paying Oregon and Arizona on these days to take our solar and turn off hydro. So this is not a sustainable model. This does not actually lead to decarbonization by itself. The other thing that we're dealing with at scale is that in California, for example, in 2025, we're going to be shutting down our last remaining large-scale nuclear plant, which will leave about a 4,000 gigawatt-hour load balancing hole. We're also working with companies like PG&E on replacing grid infrastructure like a peak power plant in the middle of Oakland. And when we look at the size of the load balancing gap that's occurring as renewables accelerate, the resources that we're looking at, storage, EVs, DR, frankly, just are not sufficient in scale to fill the gap. And for example, in the Diablo nuclear power plant closure, out of 4,000 gigawatt hours, half of those have to come from demand reductions. But when you start talking about resources like grid infrastructure, like the Dynergy 165 megawatt peak gas turbine in the middle of Oakland that is at its end of life, in order to use demand-side resources to replace a power plant, part of the grid, it has to happen during the periods of time when that plant would have been running. So we'll talk a little bit more about this, but for example, we're helping PG&E support the demand side of the Dynergy replacement by providing the ability to count for both the time and location of savings and send a price signal into the market that's associated with that. The other kind of major trend is that we are moving towards electrification of end use. So that's electrifying vehicles, but it's also electrifying buildings, moving to heat pumps, heat pump water heaters, induction ranges. And this is essential for us to decarbonize, but at the same time, much of this new load is actually going to be occurring during some of the periods of time on the grid. For example, residential heating, moving to a heat pump will actually create new loads in times of the grid that actually we're not generating a lot of renewables, that we're still running on dirty power. And so we need to think a little more holistically about what is beneficial and how we bring the kind of range of resources into the market to balance these loads. The interesting thing in electrification and energy efficiency, they're basically close cousins. When we're measuring the impact, one makes the bills go down predominantly, the other will make them go up. All of it can be expressed in a form of what we call resource curve, or the impact on demand, and how that is valued in the grid. And this is probably the simplest way to think about what it is we have to do here in California. And by the way, this is focused on our 2030 goals, which is what our RPS says we're going to reach 50% renewables. About 5 months ago, we changed that goal to a zero carbon system-wide by 2045. Frankly, we don't even have projections of what that looks like quite yet. But this graphic represents the marginal carbon intensity of a kilowatt hour on the California grid, really by hour of day, month of year. And the simplest way to think about our objectives at this point is use more of the energy when it's clean and green, and use less of it when it's red. And we're actually starting to see that kind of transition where major utilities in California are now accounting for their grid and their impact on their demand programs, not just in terms of energy, but also carbon intensity, and realigning their goals in terms of the carbon impact, not just the capacity grid value or kWh monthly savings. And so when we talk about fitting demand side flexibility, energy efficiency, and electrification into the solution set, it really comes down to how do we fit efficiency into these existing and emerging DER markets. And the biggest single challenge is that all of these other resources are time and locational, but our traditional approach to energy efficiency, which tends to be monthly averages system-wide, simply doesn't solve the type of intraday problems that we're having, and doesn't fit into these markets as an actual resource. And so that's really the fundamental problem we're trying to solve. How do we make efficiency into a DER, treat it the very same way? And really the innovation that we try to bring in this model is make efficiency work like everything else. And we're not trying to teach it a new trick. We're trying to fit it into existing markets, use the same type of finance, insurance, and market innovation that we're using across every other sector, rather than rethink or energy efficiency discretely. So the focus and kind of the lesson learned is that if you want to save intraday problems, you can't do that with monthly averages. You need to do that with flexibility, with hourly impact, and the grid is not unified. There are substantial differences in value depending on where you're located, what feeders you're attached to, and that's true both for carbon intensity but also T&D and grid value. So the fundamentals that enable this, again, is using this open source platform that we have, for example, tested on 50 million buildings here in California, so we have bound our uncertainties. We know we may not be perfect in calculating the impact, but we have the ability to discount it appropriately to create confidence by all parties. So this enables the utilities and various entities that are actually rolling out these efficiency programs, the buyers, to track their impact, forecast it, and actually integrate the impact of the demand side effect of these programs into their forecast, and treat it really as an actual procurable resource. And really for the first time ever, we're now moving that conversation where it's no longer an efficiency conversation, but it's actually a conversation that's happening with the very same folks that are making procurement decisions to buy storage, invest in new power plants and power lines. Efficiency is now entering that mix, and we're treating it in very much the same way. This is actually reflective of this is a simulated data, but essentially what many of our utility customers are looking at when they're running efficiency programs, being able to track the aggregators, contractors, and projects, on a daily basis as they're actually implemented, measuring the monthly and hourly impacts of their portfolio, being able to drill down and actually see all the way down to the actual customer level. And so it's a level of transparency and confidence that we haven't seen before. But most importantly, again, is it turns efficiency to something they can actually rely on, which makes it tremendously more valuable. One of the most important ideas in this whole conversation can be expressed in these distribution curves you see in the bottom corners. So, we think of energy efficiency typically when we're talking to customers as always a good idea. The reality that we find is that there's a distribution. There are customers where the bills actually go up after they do an intervention, and there are many that see sometimes 30 or 40% reductions. The critical piece that kind of the transition from efficiency as an engineering project to efficiency as something that is reliable as a grid resource, but also something that you can finance and insure, is starting to think about the impact at a grid level in a portfolio. And so while individual customers, there's a broad range of impact, the shape of the portfolio is very consistent. So you can have extremely high confidence intervals that you will achieve the savings at a portfolio level, whether you're a grid planner or an investor, finance and insurance company, whereas it becomes very difficult to determine on an individual level in many cases what the outcomes are going to look like. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but this is also a huge opportunity in terms of how one implements efficiency measures. It turns out that we are actually quite good at predicting who the negative savers are going to be in a portfolio and who the high savers may be as well. So once you actually start tracking, there's kind of two sides to this equation. One is being able to send a price signal that reflects the grid value into the market. The other is being able to respond to that as an actual company delivering services. And a big part of that actually comes down to identifying and targeting the right customers. Can you identify, from meter data who the high saver potentials would be and who the negatives would be, and target the right customers that will actually benefit from the intervention. Now, when we're looking at efficiency through this lens of what we call resource curve, which is measuring, and that's what we're seeing here in this blue shaded area, is the savings. The bottom side is where we're actually increasing consumption. This data is actually coming from a residential program in the California market. And we can actually now, because we're tracking at a time and locational basis, be able to quantify the actual utility avoided cost and be able to quantify the utility avoided cost in the same terms that they use for measuring the value of an investment in storage or a power plant. The other thing that is critical as we move towards goals that are more focused on decarbonization is the ability to account for carbon impacts in a way that is accurate. If you are not measuring your impacts properly, if you're not sending the right price signal, you'll have the wrong outcomes. So if you remember that chart that I showed you with the red and green, you can save energy in California and have almost no carbon impact, depending on when you do it, and you can save during other periods of time, for example, the late afternoon system ramp where we're running on fossil energy, and have huge impacts. And so when we are able to account for the time and locational impacts properly, we can then convert it using marginal, hourly, and locational carbon intensities. And this is really critical because this can really flip the equation. The traditional method to think about carbon has been monthly average savings times monthly system intensity, and you just get the wrong answer. And so as we start progressing and focusing on carbon benefits, it's critical that we're actually measuring the impact properly. And the only way to do that is on an hourly basis. And so what this enables, and I'm going to show you some examples from some work that we're doing with PG&E. And if you guys are following the news, we believe this will continue even through the bankruptcy, but these are challenging times. It's especially interesting when the utility in the U.S. that's pretty much doing the most to focus on carbon and clean energy, making the #1 buyer of solar in the U.S. and pretty much globally, is also the first to be impacted by climate change in a very, very substantial way. So it's an interesting time. But in these two graphics, the top graphic actually represents the time of savings by season for residential programs in California. And the bottom graphic is that duck curve graphic that we saw earlier, which is the system load shape. So the critical piece here is that this red box that I'm showing right now, the 4 to 8 p.m. window, is the most valuable time on the grid. It's about 6 p.m. is when the utility is making the forecast for system peak. And so that's the magic hour. That's when the most value in reducing demand actually comes in. And so from a utility perspective, what they've calculated is savings that occur in this 4 to 8 p.m. window, depending on the seasonality, are 6 to 8 times more valuable than savings that occur in the middle of the day. And so being able to quantify it enables us to. What this is enabling is, the traditional approach to energy efficiency has been programmatic and prescriptive. The basic idea is regulators, stakeholders, utilities can get together. We'll figure out what the right solutions are. We'll just develop some sort of upfront customer-facing incentive. We'll pay that incentive generally in advance, and then we'll regulate to make sure that the results are there. This is not scaling. It's not working very well. Our savings are actually lower than expected, but potentially most importantly, it inhibits the development of consumer-facing products that they actually demand. It's essentially, the way to think about this is developing a business model without any feedback loops. And so the transition that PG&E is undertaking is really moving from traditional efficiency programs that are, again, we specify the solutions in advance, pay customers based on deemed or average savings, and then regulate the implementation, to essentially opening up markets where we can treat all ECMs, any energy conservation measure, whether that is a HVAC or shell retrofit, operational behavior change, IoT device, and rather than specify the solutions, focus on valuing the outcomes. And so in PG&E's residential pay-for-performance program, we have multiple providers. There are actually 4 what we call aggregators that are out deploying a whole range of solutions to customers. Rather than paying a rebate in advance based on the measures that were installed, we've agreed on a price and a value for the savings as they're actually delivered. And the aggregators who are competing in the market for customers sign what is essentially a PPA in reverse. And in this case, that PPA specifies a 1x price for 20 hours a day, and there's a 3x multiplier during that system peak window of 4 to 8 p.m., which is a great deal for the utility when you consider the value that they see in saving energy in those time periods. So the payments, rather than upfront, are paid over time, and that payment, again, is based on a contract, an agreement on the value, with a standard agreement on how you actually measure the impact. And we're able to do that on a real-time basis and make payments on a monthly savings that occur to the aggregator. One of the most important outcomes of this is the creation of a cash flow. And so the way to look at this market is that rather than a kind of a government scheme or program where we hire an implementer, we predefined how the customer is going to interact, what their benefits going to be, what they're going to buy, the utility is paying for the savings when and where it occurs, again, like other grid resources, through a contract to the aggregator. And these aggregators are competing, and they're getting paid on the value of their portfolio as a grid resource. And because we've aligned incentives, because the value that is being paid to them is based on what actually occurs relative to the marginal cost of alternatives in the market, they have a price signal that says they're free to innovate on the business model. What products do they sell to the customer? How are their customers going to finance their benefits, the bill savings, the comfort, the health that they get out of these solutions? And then they have a cash flow with the utility based on the results. And so their business model becomes, how do I develop products customers will demand that will grow the market? How do I nudge those projects and influence them towards greater grid benefit, because they have a tertiary cash flow that's based on the value of the savings that they're delivering. So their business model becomes figure out how to sell stuff to customers they actually want that simultaneously deliver the most grid climate benefits, which is what maximizes their potential for profit and their competitiveness in the market. The key thing here is the plural on models. That we don't know what the right solutions are, and that the key thing is there will be many solutions. And so rather than prescribe how it's sold and how customers acquire, we can allow the market to compete, and we can drastically reduce the amount of regulation because the market is aligned. These aggregators that have these contracts will only get paid for their results if it actually works. And this will allow the type of innovation we need to get the types of products in the market that drive demand. So when you think of the Nests and the solar leases and the Teslas that are driving demand in many of our other DER markets, those solutions didn't come from regulators or reports. They came from really brutal competition in the market, and we need to unlock that competition and private investment to get the next generation of demand flexibility approaches that will achieve scale. The other really critical thing we get is a cash flow that represents the grid and carbon mutual benefits. When a customer retrofits a building and saves the utility on grid infrastructure and reduces carbon, those benefits accrue mutually. Those are benefits for everyone. And so we want to avoid concentrating those benefits on the individual customer and expecting them to use a form of consumer finance. Most of what we call efficiency finance is actually credit and asset based. And so can we instead aggregate that mutual benefit into a cash flow? And we're really aggregating the distributed power plant that we're building and then finance that cash flow using infrastructure investment, project finance, the very same way that we would invest in a solar farm, a grid storage facility, or frankly a coal power plant historically. And so one of the key things in pay for performance is that these aggregators and the customer are not waiting around to get paid. Just like if we were building a power plant and you get a PPA or access to a market, what you're financing is the long-term value, that cash flow, and being able to pull that forward through project finance to invest in actually the upfront costs. So this creates an alignment of incentives, and frankly, this creates the vehicle for the massive investment and capital and upfront capital costs associated with scaling energy efficiency. And again, going back to my earlier comment of making efficiency work like everything else, this is how we build grid infrastructure. And so we can't really expect, in my opinion, to make this potentially hundreds of billions of dollars behind the meter investment in energy efficiency in buildings and expect end customers to finance that, again, with their personal credit or asset value. And the key thing that enables this, and I kind of referenced this earlier, is that while efficiency is highly variable on individual assets, it is highly consistent in a portfolio. And so once we work with these aggregators and their utility counterparties to develop actuarial data sets that are proxies for the long-term performance of the different types of business models being deployed. And then those aggregators are working with insurance companies like Munich Re, but also project finance investors who will ensure that portfolio performance and provide the upfront investment to actually build the projects. So again, using infrastructure or project finance to finance the investments that need to be made in energy efficiency. So I'm going to be opening this up to some questions and comments, and I apologize for the technical difficulties as part of this process, but I wanted to just talk a little bit about the progression. So in many states, like California, New York, and soon in Australia and other parts of the world where we're experiencing really significant grid problems already as we move towards renewables at scale, there's a huge motivation. We need these resources on the grid ASAP. We really don't have enough. Storage is awesome. But it's not a silver bullet. It's expensive and in short supply. And when we do the math in the California market, because solar is accelerating so quickly, that load balancing gap, the need for load balancing resources, even under the most optimistic scenarios with storage, is actually getting bigger, not smaller over time. And so that's not a failing of storage, it's actually the success of solar. And so it's really an all hands on deck strategy. So in many markets, where where we have smart meters in place and the grid needs are acute, we're moving very quickly towards energy efficiency as a time and locational grid resource and moving it into procurement and financing and insuring it as a grid infrastructure investment. That's happening today. But at the same time, frankly, that's not happening everywhere at the same pace. And there's really a place to start pretty much wherever you are in this continuum. So even if you have monthly meters and not intervals, AMI, advanced metering infrastructure, smart meters in place, using this type of an approach to measure the savings that you're having, build data sets, and using that data it's a no regret strategy. There's no downside, and you'll get huge upside impacts very, very quickly, just in the form of targeting the right customers, sending more leads to the better aggregators or contractors in your program, doing quality assurance where it's actually needed most. There's a whole bunch of very tactical steps that just come back to if you can measure it, you can manage it. And we see kind of this progression of you take a furnace rebate program and you track it, and you can get much better results very, very quickly just with that data set. And then you can start without a fundamental shift using those KPIs, those key performance indicators of actual performance, and tying that to things like how you distribute leads or any other mechanisms within existing programs or schemes. We call that programmatic P4P. Let's just align our approaches with actual outcomes, make it more valuable to deliver better results fundamentally. And then as we look at these existing schemes, if there are alternatives in the market, if there are companies that are deploying IoT devices or other services that can save energy more cost effectively, let's also allow them into the market. And as we get AMI data and as we're able to start getting larger data sets on the time and locational impacts, value them properly. Let's start with probably, like in PG&E territories, providing bonuses for savings that are more valuable, but ultimately start to align that price signal on a time and locational basis. And again, the end goal being efficiency and electrification on par with storage and other resources in those same markets and financed and insured the same way, resulting in a competitive marketplace where customers will get products they actually want, and that innovation will occur through competition, where again, the market actors, the aggregators, have an alignment where they are competing not just for customers, but also for the results and the outcomes from the customers they acquire. So with that, I will turn it over to any thoughts or questions.